In the article "A Very Rough Guide to America from an Englishman in New York" by Paul Owens, he discusses his experience and compares the United States to the United Kingdom in several ways. A few of the areas that Mr. Owen discusses is the culture of tipping, pharmaceutical advertising on TV, and the view of public transportation in the United States. There are subpoints Mr. Owen makes about the United States that hold true, although they might be a bit exaggerated due to the nature and style of the article. In this presentation, we will be discussing both the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as Japan, which is a very different culture than both the UK and the US. In the article, Mr. Owen states you need to tip for everything and that the reason people tip is because the waiting staff are paid low hourly rates. This holds true. The United States Department of Labor indicates that the federal minimum wage is $7.25, but the hourly minimum wage for a tipped employee is $2.13. Most states have raised their own minimum wage for tipped employees, but there are still 15 states that start at $2.13. Tipping is a common practice in many industries in the United States. According to TripSavvy.com, in restaurants, it is expected that you tip your server 15 to 20% of the bill if gratuity is not already included in the bill. Bartenders should be tipped about $1 or more per drink served. Hairstylists and cab drivers are also tipped 15 to 20% of the bill when you use their services. However, now, there are restaurants in the United States that have been adding gratuity to the bill, making tipping unnecessary. This just makes sure that the employer would have to pay their staff at least the minimum wage instead of relying on the customer to tip. In the United Kingdom, tipping isn't required, but it still does occur in some situations. Most employees earn enough, so they aren't depending on tips to make a livable wage. TripSavvy provided some insight into which industries do and do not require tipping in the UK. Restaurants often have a service charge included already on the bill. If not, then a 10% tip is okay. For bartenders, a tip wouldn't be expected. A tip of £2 to £4 is okay for tour guides, while doormen and bellhops are tipped for their services at hotels. Stylists do not expect tips, but they do appreciate it. Tipping is not nearly as popular in the UK as it is in the US, so for someone coming to live in the US, it could be a bit of a surprise to see how many industries in the United States do rely on tipping. Japan is entirely different when it comes to tipping. TripSavvy states that tipping in Japan is almost considered an insult. This is because in Japan, tipping implies that the business is not paying their workers well enough or that the business isn't doing well enough to pay their workers a fair wage. Japan is a culture that values hard work, politeness, harmony, and respect. Good customer service is already expected in every business, so the Japanese, that doesn't to them they don't need to be rewarded for providing good service. In restaurants, there might be a service fee of 10 to 15%, but if there isn't, you still shouldn't tip the server. Basically, what is polite in one culture can definitely be seen as rude in another. Another point that Mr. Owen made in this article about his time in the US is that pharmaceutical companies push commercials on TV a lot. Interestingly, PubMed Central states that the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world that can advertise prescription drugs directly to consumers. Everywhere else it's prohibited. And I can see how this would be shocking to a tourist to see all of these commercials on TV that list the medications and all of their major side effects. Up until the mid 1980s, pharmaceutical companies in the United States could only promote their products to healthcare professionals, but in 1997, the FDA loosened up their restrictions on these kinds of advertisements, so now we see several of them on commercials as we watch TV any day. There are rules and regulations to what the companies can say and claim. The FDA says the claims must be truthful and non-misleading and contain a fair balance of product benefits and risks. The UK and Japan do not allow any prescription drug advertising on TV at all. They leave prescriptions up to the healthcare professional, and those are the ones that are going to be making the decisions for the patient, not the patient coming to the doctor. Advertisers are able to promote over-the-counter medicine to the public, but that is it. In Japan, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare regulates the pharmaceutical advertising. Companies are allowed to spread disease awareness campaigns, but in those campaigns, they can't mention products or brand names within the advertisement. And the final point that Mr. Owen touched on was the lack of public transportation in the United States. He mentioned that people are lucky in most parts of the country if they have any trains or subway systems at all. I would have to agree with him here. Our country is much larger than the UK or Japan, and our infrastructure is different as well. The United States has cities that are surrounded by distant suburbs, and those suburbs are connected to the cities by highways. Bloomberg discussed the differences between the US and cities in Europe, like London, explaining that city planners expanded cities in Europe and train stations so that the public transport didn't become obsolete. The United States, though, is far more dependent on the use of personal vehicles to get around, even though there still are subways and railways in major cities. Once you get out of the major cities, though, you are stuck to biking or walking if you don't have a car to drive you from point A to point B. The UK has an extensive network of trains, buses, and coaches that take passengers to destinations near and far. In London, the underground railway system known as the Tube is used on a daily basis by commuters to get to places throughout the city. JustLanded.com explains that the Tube runs to all the areas of the city, making it an incredibly useful way to travel in London. If you're not in London, there are still buses and trains available to use. Something to keep in mind is the size difference between the United States and the United Kingdom. Google Maps shows it takes 13 hours to get from the bottom of England and Plymouth all the way to the top of Scotland at John O'Groats. For comparison, it takes 12 hours just to drive across Texas from Texarkana to Fort Bliss, Texas, and that's only one state. There are a lot of rural areas as well that aren't near train stations, making their use obsolete. People are better off flying a plane far distances in the United States. In Japan, however, the railway system is an incredibly popular way to get around. The Shinkansen, or bullet train, was first introduced in 1964 between Tokyo and Osaka. Bullet trains, named after the shape of the train itself, can reach speeds of 320 kilometers per hour, according to Economic Times. These trains have a reputation for being very punctual, and the Japan Central Railway Company annual report indicated that the average delay of the Tokaido Shinkansen was just 0.7 minutes during fiscal 2018. All major Japanese cities have their own subway lines, and it is the most preferred method of transport in large cities such as Tokyo. Each Japanese island, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, are covered by a network of railways, making it a popular choice for Japan's inhabitants. If something like that existed in the United States, I am sure people would take advantage of its convenience, especially with the rising gas prices today. Overall, Paul Owen's article in The Guardian made some valid points regarding tipping culture, pharmaceutical companies, and public transportation in the United States. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but there are definitely differences between the US and the UK. And a country like Japan, who has been far from Western influences, carries some similarities between the two, but still has its own customs when it comes to social interactions, like tipping servers. Overall, I think each country has its benefits and its downfalls, and the landscape and culture of each country has influenced how it developed over the years. It would be worth visiting the UK or Japan to see for yourself how the country really is and if the differences are something you prefer over the United States. Thank you. This slide just contains image credits that have been used within the PowerPoint.